Hello and welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Layo Adegoke. Let's begin the program today with stories and happenings that made headlines over the weekend.
On Saturday, hundreds of mourners attended the funeral in Chad's capital, N'Djamena, for 5 protesters killed in demonstrations against military rule. The government said 5 people were killed in clashes on Tuesday, April the 27th. A Chadian civil society group put the death toll at 9, with dozens more injured. Civil society groups joined the mourners, saying they would continue to fight for freedom and justice after the military took power when long-serving President Idris Deby was killed on April the 19th. There were more reports of protests in the southern cities of Sahel, where demonstrators went out in the streets banging on pots and pans to denounce the transitional council and call for a return to civilian rule, according to civil society leaders in Sahel. Somalia's lower house of parliament voted unanimously on Saturday, May the 1st, to cancel a divisive 2-year presidential term extension it approved last month, a move that might help end an armed standoff in the capital, Mogadishu. The crisis over the term extension has raised fears that Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab insurgents could exploit the situation. Militants from Al-Shabaab took over at least one Somali town in the past week as heavily armed fighters moved from the countryside into the capital city. The lower house vote was broadcast on Somali television and came shortly after President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed addressed Parliament and said he was directing his Prime Minister to spearhead preparations for the election. Tunisia's Prime Minister Hicham Mechichi is seeking a $4 billion loan program from the International Monetary Fund in talks starting this week, saying politicians faced a last opportunity to save the economy. Mechichi said he expected talks to last about 2 months and had confidence Tunisia could secure financial support to help it through an economic crisis that has been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. He said he wanted a 3-year loan program and added that details of an agreement with powerful labor unions, seen as vital to unlock foreign funding, were still being finalized.
To our top stories for today. Now, military leaders in Chad, who took over after the death of the country's long-standing ruler Idris Deby last month, have named a transitional government. An army spokesperson said 40 ministers and their deputies had been appointed, and they include a former rebel chief who will now head a new national reconciliation ministry. Opposition figures say the military council, led by Mr. Deby's son, Mahamat Idris Deby Kaka, has carried out an institutional coup and say they won't be satisfied until it appoints a civilian president. The announcement came hours after the ruling military council had lifted an overnight curfew that was imposed following the president's death last month during fighting against rebels. Meanwhile, the spokesperson for the UN Human Rights Office say they are deeply disturbed by the apparent disproportionate use of force, including the use of live ammunition against protesters in Chad. Speaking to reporters in Geneva, spokesperson for the office, Mata Hurtado, called on the Chadian authorities to give clear guidelines to its security forces to refrain from using force against peaceful protesters. Moving on to Somalia, the Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Rubble has invited the leaders of federal member states for a meeting to end the elections deadlock after Parliament cancelled its move to extend the presidential term. The consultative meeting has been scheduled for the 20th of May, while Puntland and Jubaland states are yet to comment about that meeting. Election talks among regional leaders have collapsed in the past, with the leaders insisting that President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo leaves office before elections are held. There had been protests against the failure of the government to hold elections. Now the president has tasked the prime minister with leading the election talks. To security matters now, Somalia's northeastern semi-autonomous Puntland regional state has sentenced 5 Al-Shabaab militants to death. The chief of the Puntland Military Court, Colonel Ali Shire, said the 5 were found guilty of carrying out attacks targeting government officials. The convicts have 30 days to appeal against the sentencing. On the 23rd of April, the same court sentenced 8 Al-Shabaab militants to death for carrying out killings and explosions in parts of Mogad region. Well, here in West Africa, at least 16 soldiers have been killed in Niger following a weekend militant attack in the western Tahua region. The attack was carried out where more than 200 civilians had been killed in an unclaimed attack in March. The soldiers are said to have been ambushed by armed individuals near Agodo area in the region. 6 more soldiers were also injured and 1 person is still missing from that attack. Local media reports that the wounded soldiers were taken to the Tahua Regional Hospital and the dead were buried in the presence of regional authorities and defense and security officials. Tilia and Tassara areas in the Tahua region have been under a state of emergency for several months due to multiple terrorist attacks by terrorist groups in the area near the border with Mali. In South Africa, a dispute over the succession of the late Zulu king Goodwill Zwelithini is now headed to court. The first wife, Queen Sibongile Dlamini, is challenging the execution of the late monarch's will, naming the next king, amid claims that his last will may have been forged. The news of legal action comes days after the death of Queen Shiyiwe Mantfombi Dlamini Zulu. Well, she had been appointed as regent in March after King Zwelithini died in hospital from diabetes-related complications at the age of 72. But in the legal challenge that opposed Queen Mantfombi's appointment as regent, Queen Sibongile wanted the court to recognize her civil marriage to the late king as his only legally binding union. She's also demanding 50% control of his estate. Well, joining us now for more on this is Channels TV's South Africa Bureau Chief Betty Dibia. Thank you, Betty. Good to see you.
Thank you, Naya.
Well, this situation seems to be turning into a tussle over who would succeed the Zulu king. What more can you tell us about this succession now heading to court, this row now heading to court?
Well, it's not only about the succession. From what you read, you see that it's about the late king's estate as well, where the first wife, and it's not just one court case. The first wife, Queen Sibongile Madlamini, is questioning the validity of the other marriages after her because she had a civil marriage with the king in 1969, saying that in that case that they had, they were married in community of property, as the Concord had ruled not too long ago regarding marriages pre-1988, which governed her own marriage, and at that point it was supposed not to be. Any marriage pre-1988 was out of community of property. But the Concord ruled after that, after that law had even been repealed, saying that those marriages will be in community of property by default, upholding a High Court ruling, a Durban High Court ruling regarding the matter or a similar issue. Anyway, so this is way beyond. Now, 2 of her daughters as well have another case in court regarding the validity of that will, questioning certain sections. So she wants 50% of his estate, vast estate at that, and she also wants her own marriage to the king to be recognized as the only legally binding union, which gives her the right to 50% of his estate. Regarding coronation, I don't think she's quite interested in the crown because her only son, who maybe would have been in the running if she wanted to dispute the wishes of the king, that's Prince Letukudula, was murdered in Johannesburg late last year. So that's so mainly this is about the estate of the king, and her daughters in their own application, they're talking about how true the signatures and some aspects of the will, that the will may have been forged. So we have ourselves a royal rumble, brewing, and we don't know how it's going to end.
Well, so what has now been the reactions to, all of this in the royal quarters? We know that's the Queen Shiyiwe Mantfombi Dlamini Zulu. She died just a few days ago. I mean, what has been the reaction to the first wife challenging the execution of this will?
Well, people are worried about the timing, and there's still those people who are saying, do we really need all these things, these royal issues? Do we really need it? Because everything is being done at the expense of taxpayers' money. But the Prime Minister, traditional Prime Minister, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, has described it as shameful. He's quite embarrassed. And the divisions, including the brother or the siblings to the late king as well, are on one side of the divide, saying it's really shameful for them to, especially in the period of mourning, which hasn't elapsed. Remember when the king died, they gave 3 months for the period of mourning. So they're quite worried about what's going on. We've not even gotten to the point of succession now, because all these court cases are going to delay anything that will go towards that. We don't know how that will go as well.
All right then, thank you so much, South Africa Bureau Chief Betty Debian.
Thank you very much.
Moving on to other stories, but still in South Africa. On Sunday night, the country receives the first batch of Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine to boost its vaccination program. The doses will be received every week, with a total of 4.5 million doses expected by the end of June. South Africa resumed vaccination of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that had stopped being administered over reports of blood clots elsewhere. The country has so far vaccinated 318,670 people, that's according to data from the Health Ministry, and it has so far recorded over 1.5 million coronavirus cases, including 54,417 deaths. Still on COVID-19, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Guinea have started recruiting participants to test a new drug to treat people with mild to moderate forms of COVID-19. The study, called Anticov, is the largest trial in the continent to identify early COVID-19 treatments. Dr. Natalie Straub-Wolfgart is the director of the COVID-19 Response for Drugs for Neglected Diseases Institute, and says there are still very few treatment options, especially for the early stage when the severe progression could be prevented, potentially reducing transmission of the virus and maybe prevent the risk of developing post-COVID conditions. Researchers in these countries will be testing a combination of two drugs, nitazoxanide and ciclesonide. Now, this is aimed at stopping the replication of the virus, while the other decreases the likelihood of one having an inflammation, making it difficult for them to breathe when infected with COVID-19. Away from COVID-19, but still in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the country has announced the end of the latest outbreak of Ebola that has killed 6 people. The declaration comes 3 months after a resurgence of the disease was reported in North Kivu in the country's eastern region. In a statement, the UN's children agency UNICEF said a quick response by the authorities and partners had helped contain the outbreak, noting that this is the 3rd outbreak to have hit the country in less than a year. Before the latest outbreak, beginning on 7th of February, the country had announced the end of its 11th outbreak, which claimed 55 lives out of 130 cases in about 6 months. In this latest outbreak, 11 people became affected and 6 people died. The Algerian president, Abdelmadjid Tebboune, has urged his government to open a dialogue with different social partners as unrest continues over the economic crisis in the country. A government statement said Mr. Tebboune had told his cabinet to engage more widely to find ways to improve the lives of employees in the education and health sectors. Algeria is preparing for legislative elections in June against the backdrop of regular street protests over the government's failure to address unemployment of 15%, soaring prices and food shortages. It's May the 3rd, the World Press Freedom Day, a day set aside to celebrate the fundamental principles of press freedom, evaluate press freedom around the world, defend the media from attacks on their independence, and also to pay tribute to journalists for their efforts and struggle in the exercise of their profession. The theme, Information as Public Good, underscores the importance of disseminating reliable and verified information to the benefit of society. The challenging and changing communication environment and systems presents its own hurdles. Some of the factors include regulation and welfare. Well, President of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, Mr. Christopher Iziguzo, is of the view that until the challenges in journalism are addressed, Nigeria cannot be said to be enjoying press freedom. He says there is also the need for review of the guidelines that govern the broadcast media. The United Nations World Food Programme, WFP, is urgently appealing for international support amid the humanitarian catastrophe caused by unrelenting drought in Madagascar. Ahmed Daoudi, the Senior Director of Operations in the country, says children and adults are on the periphery of famine.
The situation is extremely worrisome, scary. They are on the periphery of famine, and these are images that I haven't seen for quite some time across the globe. Again, with members of the diplomatic and international community, as well as the government, is horrific images of starving children, malnourished, and not only the children, mothers, parents, and the population in the villages we visited. The writing is on the wall, the images are horrific, and what I saw with my own eyes tells me we are heading towards a disaster, and we need to stop that. We're already witnessing villages, whole villages, shutting down and moving to the nearest urban centers.
Well, it appears rhino poaching is on the rise again in South Africa. Wildlife park officials say since the government loosened coronavirus restrictions following a year-long lull due to the pandemic, many of those animals are no longer safe.
South Africa's wildlife parks fear a rebound in rhino poaching this year after a near-decade low in 2020. COVID-19 travel restrictions are easing, but tourist and anti-poaching ranger numbers remain low. Rhino poaching in South Africa plunged 33%, with 394 rhinos poached in 2020, its lowest level since 2011, after strict travel prevented easy movement across borders. Reserves have been battling tighter budgets amidst a coronavirus-induced tourism lull. Many have also been forced to cut back on anti-poaching patrols, compounding the threat to rhinos. Balule Nature Reserve, located in the Greater Kruger system and home to the Big Five, has dehorned 100 rhinos since April 2019. With easier movement across borders, the reserve uses dehorning as one of the methods to prevent armed poachers from taking advantage of the eased travel restrictions.
The COVID restrictions worked on a number of levels. The reduction of international and even local travel prevented the movement of product. Perhaps even more so, the restriction of movement of people within the parks reduced the amount of information available to the organised networks looking for rhino horn. And that's one of the reasons why poaching numbers were down. There is a very real and realised threat as poaching pressure has increased since lockdown, perhaps to meet the demand from the international markets.
South Africa implemented a nationwide lockdown in March last year and began easing international travel restrictions in November.
So since November, December last year and into 2021, this landscape and particularly Kruger National Park has been experiencing serious numbers of rhino poaching incidents.
The country's environmental ministry is expected to release its 2021 half-year poaching figures at the end of June.
In Bululi, we have decided to dehorn our entire population because of our high level of threat. We dehorn every rhino, and even rhinos with calves. We would immobilize the calf together with the cow, and even the calves' horns will be ground down to a safe level.
South Africa has been at the center of poaching crisis. The Ministry of Environment says there are about 16,000 rhinos in the country. Rhino poaching often involves both local poachers and international criminal syndicates that smuggle the high-value commodity across borders, often to Asia, where demand is high.
Egyptians are marking second Easter amidst the coronavirus pandemic vis-a-vis the Muslim Ramadan. The Christians are celebrating Easter amid these coronavirus restrictions. While public parks are closed and large gatherings prohibited, the Easter Mass is still held in limited numbers.
Egypt's government ordered parks closed on Easter Monday, May the 3rd, a time when families usually gather with food to enjoy the traditional spring holiday of Shem al-Nasim outdoors. However, prayers at churches were permitted with strict procedures as Christians celebrated the second Easter amidst the pandemic. A handful of Egyptians attended prayers on Saturday night, wearing masks and social distancing in almost empty pews. During Easter, Christians and Muslims alike buy aged salty fish or salted grey mullet, which they eat with hard-boiled eggs, green onions and lettuce. But this year, turnout at shops was low, with Muslims fasting during Ramadan.
Despite its falling during Ramadan, it's still a tradition, and we're used to doing certain things during Shem al-Nasim, and the coronavirus did not stop us. And thank God, everything is good.
The government organized a virtual tour of famous parks in Cairo, with the Easter at Home tagline displayed on the videos. As of Sunday, May 2nd, Egypt recorded 229,635 coronavirus cases, with 13,469 deaths.
And that's it on the program for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Layo Adigoke.